Let's talk the way I would if you came into my office and told me your morning blood sugar readings have been creeping up, even though the rest of your day looks completely fine on paper. This is actually one of the more common and more confusing patterns I see in patients who are just starting to monitor their blood sugar or who've recently gotten a continuous glucose monitor. They eat a reasonable dinner, don't snack late, sleep a full night, and yet their fasting blood sugar first thing in the morning is higher than it was before they went to bed. It feels backwards, and I understand why it's confusing. Let's talk about what's actually happening because this pattern has a name, and understanding the mechanism changes how you should think about it. This is called the dawn phenomenon, and it's driven by a completely normal hormonal process that becomes clinically significant, specifically in people who are developing or already have insulin resistance. Here's the mechanism, step by step, the way I'd want you to actually understand it, not just accept as an unexplained pattern. In the early morning hours, typically between about 3 and 8 in the morning, your body naturally releases a surge of several hormones, including cortisol, growth hormone, and epinephrine, as part of preparing you to wake up and become active. This is a completely normal, universal, human physiological process. Everyone experiences this hormonal surge to some degree, regardless of their blood sugar status. Here's what these hormones do specifically relevant to blood sugar. They signal your liver to release stored glucose into your bloodstream, essentially providing a ready energy supply in anticipation of you waking up and needing fuel for the day ahead. In someone with healthy insulin sensitivity, your pancreas responds to this glucose release with an appropriately calibrated insulin response, keeping your blood sugar within a normal range despite this hormonal surge. Here's where it becomes clinically significant. In someone with developing or established insulin resistance, that same hormonal surge triggers the same liver glucose release, but the corresponding insulin response isn't sufficient to keep pace, resulting in blood sugar that rises more than it should, specifically during those early morning hours, often peaking right around when you wake up and check your fasting glucose. This is precisely why this particular morning pattern, elevated fasting blood sugar despite reasonable eating and sleep habits the night before, can actually serve as one of the earlier, more sensitive indicators of developing insulin resistance, sometimes appearing before other more commonly discussed warning signs. I want to distinguish this from a related but mechanistically different pattern called the Somogyi effect, because they can look similar on paper but have opposite underlying causes, and this distinction matters clinically. The Somogyi effect involves blood sugar dropping too low overnight, sometimes due to excessive diabetes medication or insufficient evening food intake, which triggers your body's stress hormone response to correct that low blood sugar, resulting in a rebound high reading by morning. If you're on diabetes medication and experiencing morning highs, it's important to determine which pattern you're actually experiencing, since the appropriate response differs significantly, and this genuinely requires your doctor's involvement, potentially using a continuous glucose monitor to see your overnight pattern directly, rather than guessing based on the morning number alone. Assuming we're talking about the dawn phenomenon specifically related to developing insulin resistance rather than medication-related overnight lows, here's what I want you to understand about why catching this early matters so much. The dawn phenomenon, when it begins appearing or worsening in someone who previously had normal morning readings, can be one of the earlier detectable signs that insulin resistance is developing, sometimes appearing before your daytime blood sugar readings show any consistent abnormality, and often well before a standard annual blood test like a fasting glucose or hemoglobin A1C might flag a problem, depending on your specific testing frequency and pattern. Here's what I'd recommend practically if you're noticing this pattern. First, track it properly before drawing conclusions. Check your blood sugar first thing upon waking before eating or drinking anything for at least 5 to 7 consecutive mornings to establish whether this is a consistent pattern rather than occasional variation, which everyone experiences to some degree. Second, if you have access to a continuous glucose monitor, either through a prescription or an over-the-counter option now available in many states, this provides far more useful information than isolated morning checks, since it shows your entire overnight glucose curve, helping distinguish true dawn phenomenon from a Somogyi pattern rebound. and showing exactly when during the early morning your glucose begins rising. Third, bring the specific pattern to your doctor using the term dawn phenomenon directly and ask about appropriate next steps, which may include a hemoglobin A1C test, a fasting insulin level, or in some cases, a formal glucose tolerance test, depending on your specific situation and risk factors. Now, I want to talk about what you can actually do about this pattern beyond just monitoring and discussing it with your doctor, because there are genuine evidence-based lifestyle strategies that can meaningfully improve dawn phenomenon specifically. Evening exercise has been shown in some research to improve next morning glucose levels, likely through improved overnight insulin sensitivity following physical activity. Even a moderate evening walk, rather than only exercising earlier in the day, may provide specific benefit for this particular pattern. The composition of your dinner matters here too. A dinner with adequate protein and fiber, rather than one heavy and refined carbohydrates, tends to produce a more stable overnight glucose pattern, reducing the degree of rise your liver's morning glucose release needs to correct from. Sleep quality deserves specific mention as well, since poor sleep has been directly shown in research to worsen next morning insulin resistance and blood sugar readings, creating a pattern that can compound with dawn phenomenon specifically, since both cortisol regulation and glucose metabolism are tightly connected to sleep quality. Now, if you're finding this helpful, this is exactly the kind of detailed, clinically accurate explanation I like providing on this channel. The kind of context that helps you actually understand your own numbers rather than just reacting to them without knowing what they mean. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe because there's more content like this coming. Let's talk about medication timing too, briefly, since this is relevant for patients already on diabetes medication experiencing this pattern. Some medications, particularly certain formulations of metformin, can be adjusted in timing by your doctor specifically to better address dawn phenomenon. And this is a genuine conversation worth having if you're noticing this pattern despite already being on treatment. Let's talk about stress too, since chronic stress elevates cortisol throughout the day, not just during the natural early morning surge. And this can compound and worsen dawn phenomenon specifically in people already prone to it. Stress management, while not a complete solution on its own, is a reasonable complementary piece of addressing this pattern comprehensively. Let's talk about weight and visceral fat too, since this connects directly back to the insulin resistance mechanism underlying dawn phenomenon in the first place. Research has consistently shown that reducing visceral fat specifically through the kinds of comprehensive approaches we've discussed elsewhere improves overall insulin sensitivity, which in turn tends to improve dawn phenomenon severity as part of that broader improvement. Let's talk timeline, because I want to give you an honest, realistic picture here. If you make consistent changes, evening exercise, improved dinner composition, better sleep, some patients notice improvement in their morning readings within 2 to 3 weeks. More significant, sustained improvement, particularly if underlying insulin resistance is meaningfully improving, typically takes longer, often several months of consistent effort. And this really should be tracked alongside your doctor through appropriate testing, not just morning glucose checks alone. Let me answer a few questions patients frequently ask me about this specific pattern. First, does having dawn phenomenon mean I definitely have or will develop diabetes? Not necessarily, and I want to be careful here. Dawn phenomenon exists on a spectrum, and mild versions can occur even in people with generally healthy blood sugar regulation. It's the degree, consistency, and trend over time that matters clinically, which is exactly why proper tracking and discussion with your doctor, rather than panicking over an isolated reading, is the appropriate response. Second, should I eat something right when I wake up to bring my morning number down? Generally, no, and this is a common misconception. Eating doesn't correct dawn phenomenon, since the issue is your liver's glucose release and your body's insulin response to it, not a lack of food in your system. Eating shortly after can actually add to your total glucose load on top of what your liver has already released, rather than solving the underlying pattern. Third, if my continuous glucose monitor shows this pattern, is that enough for a diabetes diagnosis on its own? No, a formal diabetes diagnosis requires specific standardized testing, typically fasting plasma glucose, hemoglobin A1C, or an oral glucose tolerance test, interpreted by your doctor according to established clinical criteria. A continuous glucose monitor is an excellent tool for identifying patterns and prompting further conversation, but it isn't itself a diagnostic test in the formal clinical sense. So here's what I want you to take away from our conversation today. Elevated morning blood sugar, even when your evening habits look reasonable, isn't a random or meaningless pattern. It reflects a specific, well-understood hormonal process, your body's natural early morning surge of cortisol and related hormones. And when that pattern becomes consistently pronounced, it can be one of the earlier, more sensitive indicators that insulin resistance is developing, sometimes before other more commonly recognized warning signs appear. Track this pattern properly, bring it to your doctor by name, and know that evening exercise, dinner composition, sleep quality, and addressing visceral fat are all genuine, evidence-based levers available to you, working alongside whatever additional testing or treatment your doctor recommends based on your specific situation. If you found this helpful, my next video breaks down exactly what a continuous glucose monitor reveals about hidden blood sugar spikes throughout an ordinary day, even in people without any diabetes diagnosis at all. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.